Speaker in this first afternoon session is Claire Loughlin, Research Fellow on the Scottish Privy Council project based here at the University of Stirling. And she's going to talk to us about clerical petitions, religious dissension and the Privy Council of Scotland circa 1690 to 1708. So once again,
hopefully now everyone can hear me. The Privy Council of Scotland played a vital role in the development and enforcement of religious policy in the early modern period. As the effective executive of Scotland's Parliament, the Privy Council was responsible for the implementation of legislation to uphold the authority of the established church, and thus to curb religious dissension and opposition to that church. And these responsibilities were especially significant in the wake of the Revolution of 1688-90, which brought about the overthrow and exile of the Catholic James VII. It also overturned the Episcopalian structure that had governed the Church of Scotland since the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Presbyterian government was re-established in 1690, yet the relationship between the Privy Council and the re-established church has not received significant scholarly attention. In these years, historians have focused primarily on the church's relation to Scotland's Parliament, especially in relation to the Union of 1707. Geoffrey Stephen argued that Parliament was of great importance to the Church in promoting its vision for extending Presbyterianism across the country and supporting its efforts to clamp down on religious dissension in various forms. This picture, however, becomes more complicated when we consider the Church's interactions with the Privy Council. So this paper begins this work by exploring the Privy Council's responses to clerical petitions about the increase of popery in Scotland in the 1690s and 1700s. Clerical petitions, as Alistair Rafe has shown, were an important means of expressing grievances to the civil authorities. Catholicism, of course, was a near constant concern in Scotland after the Reformation. After 1688, the need to stamp out popery was given greater urgency due to Catholic support for the exiled Stuarts. In the years after 1690, vast numbers of petitions about the increase of popery were compiled by church courts at local and national level for the attention mostly of the Privy Council. They typically contained a summary of the number of Catholics in a particular parish or region, the dangerous activities in which these papists were supposedly engaging, and a plea for action by the authorities. I'll suggest today that examining these representations and how the Privy Council responded to them provides useful insights and raises important questions into the relationship between the Church and the Council. And these questions are especially interesting to think about when we consider that the relationship between institutions of government and the Church of Scotland was not straightforward, with no clear-cut divide between church and state. The Crown appointed commissioners to preside over the General Assembly, the Church's highest court. Additionally, the Presbyterian system incorporated lay people into the government of the Church at every level through the role of lay elders. And this meant that political elites often sat on the ruling committees in church courts, giving them considerable influence in the church's decision-making, at least at national level. This overlap and its implications has not been explored in depth by scholars, but it points to some of the ambiguities and relations between members of the Privy Council as politicians and as members of the Church of Scotland. So first, I'll briefly outline the state of Scotland's Catholic community after the Revolution and the actions taken against popery by the Privy Council. It then examines the petitions composed by church courts from the later 1690s about the increase of popery. And as we will see, complaints from church courts about Catholic expansion were overwhelmingly ignored by members of the Privy Council, despite the fact that for most of the 1690s, it was the council rather than the church that had been most proactive in clamping down on popery. The paper then explores some of the reasons for this disparity in attitude about Scotland's Catholic problem, revealing some of the tensions between the Privy Council and ministers of the re-established church. Next slide, please, Alistair. So by 1680, there were perhaps about 24,000 Catholics in Scotland, about 2% of the total population. An official Catholic mission to Scotland was first constituted in 1653, but this had not led to significant Catholic expansion. Suffering from a constant shortage of priests and money, the mission focused on affirming the faith among communities known to be receptive to Catholicism, rather than on massive expansion into new territories. Most Catholics lived in the Hebrides, the Highlands and the northeastern lowlands. Yet in many parishes in these areas, Catholics often outnumbered Protestants, and some parishes were almost entirely Catholic. Smaller pockets of recusants also persisted further south, particularly in Edinburgh and the southwest. Despite their small numbers, the Revolution of 1688-90 prompted an eruption of violence against popery. Houses of well-known Catholics were attacked across the country, and port burnings were staged in cities including Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen. These were not solely the actions of the mob, but were sanctioned and approved by leading political figures. According to Colin Lindsay, Earl of Balcarres, nor did the council anything to hinder these disorders. Renewed legal restrictions on Catholicism quickly followed. In 1687, James VII had granted a formal toleration to Catholics, but this was repealed in 1689, and laws curtailing Catholic worship, education and finances were reintroduced in 1690. Now, Catholics bewailed these moves for ushering in a period of unremitting persecution. Writing from Dunkirk in 1691, and I've put the quote on the slide there, the priest Thomas Nicholson declared that priests could find no safe residence anywhere, but were liable to be apprehended wherever they were found. Nicholson blamed this persecution on the terrible Calvinist sect of Presbyterians who now governed the Church of Scotland. Their hatred of us is stolid and implacable, he averred. It was this sect who first overthrew the Catholic religion in Scotland, and they have persecuted it ever since with unrelenting fury. Most Catholics would have agreed with the sentiment that Presbyterian ministers were to blame for their travails. In fact, however, for most of the 1690s, it was the Privy Council rather than church courts who were the main drivers of efforts against Catholicism. Now, this was not necessarily the full-scale persecution that Catholics claimed. A royal proclamation of 1690 promised protection for all who lived peaceably, and arrested Catholics were usually released from prison upon promises of quiescence. Nevertheless, Catholics were still subjected to harassment and prosecution, primarily at the instigation of the Privy Council. In 1693, at the request of the Lord Advocate, Sir James Stewart of Gutters, the Council appointed a dedicated committee for deporting priests abroad, and this committee was kept quite busy throughout the decade. The Council also endorsed disruptions to Catholic worship. In February 1695, for instance, Stewart of Gutters reported that officials had discovered Mass being celebrated in a house on Edinburgh's Canongate. The celebrant, the Jesuit David Fairfull, was arrested along with 3 members of the congregation, and a list was compiled of the other attendees for monitoring. And similar instances are peppered throughout the Council's registers. These repeated crackdowns on Catholic worship are quite interesting because they contrast sharply with the situation in England at this time. Although England had a larger resident community, and indeed probably in many places a much more prominent one, no Catholic chapels were closed by the authorities there after 1689, and the authorities indeed mostly turned a blind eye to private worship. But in Scotland, we see that attendees of Mass remained exposed to prosecution. Anti-Catholic spectacles also persisted, again at the instigation of the Council. In 1691, next slide please, Alistair. In 1691, to commemorate the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot, the Council agreed to revive the usual solemnities and tokens of joy that had marked the day in the years before James's reign, in thanks for that gracious and miraculous deliverance. And of course, the celebrations would now have added significance as the anniversary of William of Orange's landing. Other such incidents included a bonfire of Popish books discovered in a private house in Edinburgh. Significantly, these prosecutions and actions all occurred independently of pressure from church courts. Indeed, there was scant discussion about popery among church courts in these years, not even in response to political crises such as the invasion scare of 1692 or the attempted assassination of William in 1696. The General Assembly did issue an overture against papists in 1690, in which presbyteries, so those are regional church courts, were recommended to take special notice what papists are in their bounds and take pains to reclaim them. But little effort was made to put this into practice. In response to a small cluster of complaints about Catholic activity on Skye in 1695, the Assembly instructed synods and presbyteries to send the names of suspected Catholics directly to the Privy Council without giving these church courts any further discussion or advice, indicating that popery was an issue chiefly for the civil authorities rather than necessarily ministers. This dynamic, however, began to change towards the end of the 1690s when signs of a Catholic recovery in Scotland were underway. Thomas Nicholson, mentioned earlier, was appointed Vicar Apostolic in 1694. He returned to Scotland in 1697 and began to reorganise the Catholic mission. This renewed visibility of papists caused alarm. It was no coincidence that church courts began to complain of an increase of popery from 1697 onwards. In 1698, for instance, the Synod of Argyll found that trafficking Jesuits were present in the Highlands and Western Isles. In the northeast, one presbytery noted that priests were trafficking through the country and more confident than ever. In 1699, responding to these local complaints, the General Assembly urged ministers to be more diligent in converting papists and preventing apostates. This uptick in clerical anxiety, however, was not shared by the Privy Council. Next slide, please, Alistair. The Council did issue a new proclamation of the penal laws in 1698. However, there was no increase in prosecutions of Catholics or indications of a more rigorous clampdown on worship beyond the routine efforts discussed earlier. And while Parliament passed an act for preventing the growth of popery in 1700, this was not accompanied by any practical measures for enforcement. But the passage of the 1700 Act did encourage church courts regularly to compile lists of papists for the Privy Council to facilitate prosecutions, as well as petitions concerning the increase of popery. Next slide, please. A glance at these petitions reveals considerable frustration about Catholic activity, and I've put a few quotes up on the slide there. As the Synod of Argyll explained in 1703, its ministers were grappling with a region overspread with papists who acted with impunity, openly celebrating Mass as if in a popish country. Catholics were equally brazen in southern Scotland. The Presbytery of Edinburgh reported to the Council that they were struggling with professed papists teaching public schools, speaking against and seducing from the Protestant religion. The Presbytery of Glasgow similarly informed the Lord Advocate that a resort of papists went openly to a house in Kilsyth for Mass. Now, clerical petitions all claimed that the reason for this increase of popery stemmed from lax enforcement of the penal laws. Priests were occasionally arrested and banished by local magistrates, but often they would simply resume work in a different district. And it did not help that in many Highland parishes, the chief landowners or heritors in those places of heavy Catholic population were often Catholics themselves or had Catholic relatives and friends. Church courts claimed that without sufficient civil support, they could do little to combat popery. As local officials could not be relied on to do this, ministers turned to the Privy Council to enforce the legislation from above. Yet despite receiving an influx of petitions and lists of papists, the Privy Council did not take any discernible action against Catholicism. In April 1702, for instance, the Presbytery of Edinburgh submitted a list of papists and a petition to the Lord Advocate, still Stuart of Gutters. Now, Gutters raised the issue at a meeting of the Council in June, which agreed to appoint a committee to inquire into the growth of popery, headed by Stuart himself. By December, however, the registers show that this committee had yet to meet, and there is no evidence that it actually did meet. This was despite the Presbytery twice sending ministers to meet with Gutters personally about the list. Ministers probably hoped that representations from the General Assembly or its commission as the national courts of the Church would carry more weight. So in 1703, the Assembly petitioned Queen Anne and the Privy Council jointly, bemoaning the extraordinary growth of popery and bold and insolent trafficking of popish priests and Jesuits. The Assembly also sent a separate address to the Council with an extensive account of Catholic activities, begging its members to enforce the penal laws in light of the evidence it was producing. The Council promised to take this under consideration, but once again, no action was taken. And this became a predictable and frustrating pattern. Despite extensive efforts by church courts demanding the authorities clamp down on popery, they overwhelmingly failed to convince the Council to take such action. So there are several possible explanations for this dynamic. First, it should be said that the lax enforcement of the penal laws was not a new phenomenon. As Alan McInnes has shown, the penal laws were proclaimed on multiple occasions throughout the 17th century, but were rarely enforced to their full might. Second, ministers and council members probably had different views on what effective enforcement of the penal laws entailed. Civil authorities tended to prioritise disarming suspected Catholics and weapons and other assets that could be used to the advantage of the Jacobites. By contrast, clerical petitions agitated for a more wide-ranging application of the moral and pastoral aspects of the penal laws, such as the clauses concerning marriages and the education of Catholic children. In 1704, for instance, the General Assembly began petitioning for better legislation so that mixed marriages between Protestants and Catholics would be more directly prohibited. Nevertheless, we might expect council members to be at least a little bit more perturbed about popery at this point, particularly given the ongoing Jacobite threat. Yet this does not appear to have been the case. Strikingly, when the Privy Council did move against papists, these decisions occurred entirely independently of clerical petitioning. Next slide, please. Best example of this comes from 1704, when the Privy Council secured royal assent for a new proclamation of the penal laws. The General Assembly interpreted this proclamation as a belated response to its petitioning efforts. However, the Council's actions were actually prompted primarily by news of public disturbances in the southwest. In January 1704, the Council received reports that over Christmas, several turbulent people in Nithsdale and Dumfriesshire, upon pretence of searching for priests and Jesuits, had committed a great many acts of oppression and violence upon the houses of several noblemen and gentlemen. Now, Dumfriesshire was home to the prominent Catholic family, the Maxwells of Nithsdale, and the Presbytery of Dumfries had been struggling to discipline the Earl of Nithsdale for various moral offences for some years. As Karen Bowie noted, the unrest that erupted in the southwest at this point attested to popular resentment of government apathy towards papists. Indeed, I find it very interesting that the mob that attacked the Catholic houses over Christmas was led by 3 Presbyterian ministers. Surely on Christmas Eve they should have been thinking of other things, but apparently not. It was this violence that spurred the Privy Council to act. It immediately appointed a committee for apprehending priests, similar to the committees that had existed in the 1690s but had subsequently fallen by the wayside. The committee was also charged with considering more effectual methods for suppressing the said tumults and rabbles. The Council's request to Anne for a new proclamation of the penal laws came when it heard that the mob had marched into Dumfries and staged a bonfire of popish books and images. Finally, the Council ordered that any popish vestments, trinkets and other seized items be brought to Edinburgh up from Dumfries for its own official public bonfire. Collectively, these actions were designed as a public display of the Council's diligence against popery, and crucially to prevent the anti-Catholic disorders from spilling over into widespread civil unrest. This is coming just a few months really after the Glasgow riots had caused serious breakdown of authority in the city there. Crucially, this all occurred independently of clerical petitioning, and it did not lead to any significant upsurge in prosecutions. Although some priests were arrested in 1704, these arrests followed the usual pattern of temporary imprisonment and then release. And certainly as far as secular clergy are concerned, after 1705, you don't get any recorded arrests of them until 1726, long after the council had been abolished. So the council's actions, or lack thereof, underline the continued hollowness of civil gestures against popery. However, they also point to a puzzling dynamic within the Church of Scotland itself. Stewart of Gutters and other members of the council were typically members of the General Assembly and its commission. They were, moreover, usually among those appointed to sit as lay elders on the Church's various committees for discussing popery. As such, members of the Privy Council endorsed the decisions by church courts to petition for civil redress. In 1703, for instance, Gutters sat on the commission of the General Assembly's Committee Against Papists, which resolved to apply to the Privy Council for the execution of the penal laws. Next slide, please. One more. In explaining this, we might look to ideas of government management of the Church. The years after 1690 were characterised by considerable tension between ministers of the established Church, the Crown and other government officials, particularly over questions of Presbyterian divine right in church government. This is something that Alistair Rafe has explored in great detail. Ministers often accused the Crown-appointed commissioners and politically malleable clergy of blocking acts that appeared to undermine the royal prerogative over the Church through management. Now, when I say management, this could take several forms. It could either be the commissioner dissolving the assembly early, or more commonly, burying motions in committees and subcommittees so that they would be discussed, but they'd never make it into the main assembly arena, for want of a better word, or passed as official acts. Evidence suggests that representations of popery were possibly endorsed as part of a broader management strategy. In 1703, for instance, the Presbyterian minister Robert Woodrow noted that the General Assembly had composed a particular and very free address against popery for the Privy Council, and this was the address mentioned earlier, composed by a committee that included Stewart of Gutters. The commissioner accepted this petition, but almost immediately afterwards peremptorily dissolved the assembly for fear that ministers were attempting to pass an act about the Church's right to call and dissolve assemblies without Crown permission. Promising action against popery was thus perhaps a way of appeasing grievances and deflecting attention elsewhere. If this strategy was not especially successful, it nevertheless provides an important reminder that attitudes towards popery were not uniform within Scottish Presbyterianism. the Church's clerical and lay members had very different opinions about the severity of the Catholic threat and the most appropriate responses to it. The frustration that this caused was palpable, as you'll see on the slide. In 1705, the Synod of Aberdeen lambasted the Privy Council for not taking the Catholic problem seriously enough, declaring that there had been no such execution of the foresaid good laws amongst us as hath in the least put any stop to the growth of popery, either by apprehending any priests trafficking papists or ascetics, the names of which are the same with witnesses, we have again and again been sent to Edinburgh according to appointment. Others even expressed their reluctance to compile new petitions or lists of papists, recognising that nothing will come of them. While this did not necessarily signify a full breakdown in relations, it nevertheless suggests that there is a degree of a lack of trust on an issue which supposedly united all Protestants. So, to conclude, clerical petitions about the increase of popery reveal some of the tensions between the Privy Council and the Church of Scotland. These two institutions had different views on the nature and severity of the Catholic threat, but their respective positions changed in the period under consideration. In the 1690s, it was the Council rather than the Church that was the main driver of action against popery. By the early 1700s, however, as ministers began agitating for a more wide-ranging application of the penal laws, the Council's priorities had moved on. Moreover, complaints about popery became a tool for placating other grievances, ensuring that the Church did not, in effect, overstep the mark in other matters. Yet the fact that members of the Privy Council also sat in the Church courts raises interesting questions, to my mind, about how relations between these two institutions worked in practice. It also raises questions about how the Council viewed and responded to other rival confessions in Scotland, most obviously the disestablished Episcopalians, but also Quakers and, most intriguingly, the small but growing body of Presbyterian dissenters out with the established church that were fast becoming a headache for the Church of Scotland. Paying close attention to the interactions between the Council and the Church in these matters might yield a more textured understanding of the intersections between religion and politics in this period. I wish that I had more answers for you at this point, and hopefully this is something that we'll be able to explore in the project in more detail. But for now, we may say that clerical petitions about popery, far from revealing a supportive dynamic between the Privy Council and the Church, instead highlight a relationship fraught with complexities, conflicts, and competing agendas that is ripe for consideration.
Thank you very much, Claire. It was fascinating, and I'm sure will give us plenty of food for discussion when we get to the questions in a moment. And yet another reminder to the three allegedly senior members of this project that we have got a long way to go until we delve into the Privy Council quite as much as the supposedly junior representative. Anyway, thank you. Again, we'll hold questions to the end. So we'll move on to the next paper in this panel. And one of the things that we hope to do in this project, I think, is to bring in outside expertise. And to that end, we're delighted to have, speaking with us this afternoon, Graham Millen, who has, I think, just finished a PhD.
Yeah, I've just submitted it.
Just submitted
I've had the Viva, the whole lot.
Well done that you survived it. That's
Thank
great. He's, as I say, just finished his PhD at the University of Kent, which was focused largely on the Highland War at the late 1680s, early 1690s. And it's that he's going to talk to us about today. And the paper is called Precedents, Committees and Conflict, Scottish Privy Council and the Organisation of the Highland War. So,
Thanks very much for that introduction, Alan, and thanks for having me today. I'm so thrilled to be here, and it's such a crucial project. I'm really enthusiastic about the Privy Council record, so it's great to see more work being done on it. The Scottish Privy Council's role during the Highland War, or First Jacobite Rising, as some prefer, was not a novel or a revolutionary one. The Council's organisation of the war effort during this period was based upon tried and tested precedents. As Laura Reynes states, the Council saw their role in day-to-day governance and thus their importance increase during the 1690s. The Council acted as a critical nexus for coordination and communication between the Army in the field, the Parliament in Edinburgh and the Crown in London, dealing with issues from the levying of regiments, commissioning of officers, relaying requests to the Scottish Treasury, as well as issuing direct orders or recommendations, and I'll come back to that last one in a bit. First, a wee bit of background. The Highland War, which lasted from 1689 to 1691, erupted in the wake of the 1688 Dutch invasion of England and subsequent revolution there. In Scotland, this led to a meeting of the Convention of Estates held in March 1689, and the decision of the Estates to depose King James VII II in favour of his Dutch son-in-law and nephew, Prince William of Orange, later William II and III, and his wife Mary. This did not, however, go down very well with James's militant supporters, no matter how few they were, spearheaded by Major General John Graham of Claverhouse, 1st Viscount of Dundee. When it became abundantly clear that the majority of the convention supported, or at least acquiesced to, the new succession, Dundee climbed the walls of Edinburgh Castle on the 18th of March 1689, spoke with the similarly loyal Governor George Gordon, Duke of Gordon, encouraging him to hold out before departing the city with a retinue of 60 former army officers in tow. Whilst James' supporters, of course Jacobites, were able to harness sympathetic Highland clans to rally an army fairly rapidly, William's supporters, from here on referred to as Williamites, just for the, it's easier to say, had politically outmanoeuvred their opponents by seizing control of the convention, and as a result causing Dundee's withdrawal. The Williamites had attained de jure control of the government of Scotland. What they then had to do was secure de facto control of the country militarily. But in order to do so, they would have to exploit the fiscal military levers their political victory had afforded them access to. The 1688's long received attention as the moment in which the British state, and I'm saying that with a small s, underwent a radical and revolutionary transformation with the rise of the fiscal military state, explored by the likes of Brewer and Jones, largely in an English context. Now, the impact of the revolution upon the Scottish state has received considerably less attention, particularly when it comes to the Highland War, which is admittedly a brief moment. The revolution in Scotland saw the reassertion of parliamentary power, as well as the shift back to Presbyterianism at the expense of Episcopalianism in the church settlement. However, within the realm of warfare, the Scottish Williamite government preferred to play it safe, with its approach best described as evolutionary and incremental. Scotland was, of course, no stranger to the standing army by this point, with the first iterations coming under the Covenanters in the 1640s, and a modest establishment which was revived after the Restoration by Charles II and then expanded upon by his brother after 1685. But the Williamites encountered an obstacle that was quite familiar to their Covenanter predecessors in 1638-39. They had no army to speak of. In late 1688, King James had drawn his Scottish army alongside its Irish counterpart into England to face the Dutch invasion forces. With the collapse of the King's morale due to several high-profile desertions at Salisbury Plain, James elected to disband his forces before returning to London. And although William had allowed James's Scottish army to march back into Scotland in December, provided they were disarmed, the exile of King James left the army devoid of an effective figurehead. Moreover, the remnant government of James in Scotland saw their authority and control collapse, not only due to his absence, but the absence of a coercive military presence at their disposal. And the result was a period of intense political and social turmoil in many of the localities of Scotland. Regardless, in 1689, William's nascent Scottish government was faced with the prospect of an impending Jacobite threat, most feasibly from the Highland clans sympathetic to Viscount Dundee, and quite possibly from the large Jacobite constituency in Ireland, buoyed by the exiled King's return on the 12th of March 1689. And this threat of a pincer movement of the Highland clans rapidly descending upon the lowlands and an invading Irish army landing upon the west coast, facilitated of course by the help of the French Navy, loomed large in the minds of William's Scottish supporters. I don't think they ever really got over Montrose or Macaulay. So an army was needed and fast. And the best way to organise and levy one was to model the structure upon precedents. And John Young's best described the 1689 Convention and later Parliament as drawing upon, quote, the constitutional heritage of 1640 and 41. The heritage of the Covenanters' national military system, which has best been explored by Edward Furgo, was to pull together Scotland's resources from the localities. And this system saw the heavy use of local and parliamentary committees via the convention at first to direct the localities from the centre, with each borough or shire levying recruits, equipping them and providing revenue to fund the war based upon national quotas. The committees were appointed by the Convention, with the Committee of Estates acting as the interim executive. And despite being offered the Crown in April 1689, William and Mary did not accept the Scottish Crown until the 11th of May that year. Until then, the Transitional Committee of Estates acted as executive coordinators, with the Council taking over by virtue of a commission issued by William and Mary on the 24th of May 1689 and subsequently approved by the Convention. Effectively, the Council was given a warrant to govern the kingdom during the Parliament's adjournment, and quite similar to the temporary come permanent role played by the Committee of Estates in the 1640s. And this precedent stood the Williamites in good stead, as the Committee of Estates had allowed them to begin levying an army within weeks of Dundee's departure, with the foot regiments commissioned on the 19th of April and troops of horse from the 22nd to the 25th of the same. On paper, the Scottish Williamite army would amount to around 7,000 men, compared to the 2,000 strong Jacobite force Dundee was able to muster by the Battle of Killiecrankie, although the numbers fluctuate throughout the war for both sides. It must be noted that the dispatch of foreign auxiliaries, such as the Scots Dutch Brigade and Royal Scottish Dragoons, and I couldn't not mention the brigade having done my thesis on it, was critical to shoring up the inexperienced Williamites, with the Scots Dutch Brigade actually arriving to act as a vanguard for William's interest as early as the 27th of March 1689. And an additional side note is the warrant actually predated the Convention's sitting, so they were intended to be there much earlier. Moreover, the two commanding officers of these formations, the Dragoons and the Brigade, Major General Hugh Mackay of Scourie and Colonel Thomas Livingston, would both act as Scottish Commander-in-Chief in turns, the first Mackay from 1689 to late 1690, and the second Livingston for the remainder of the conflict from late 1690 until 1691. The Williamite army the government had raised was far from perfect, with Mackay noting in early 1689 that, quote, the chief officers were all noblemen of no service, end quote, and that said nobles, quote, chose the officers of their regiments according as they had a kindness for their persons, or as they judged them popular to get a number of men together to the disorder of those troops. William's new Privy Councillors, including Lord George Melville and William Hamilton, 3rd Duke of Hamilton, quickly began to transition to the business of everyday governance. The Council became the central coordinating body for the Williamite government. Effectively, the Council supplanted the Committee of Estates by directing the war effort centrally, of course via the Parliament and the local committees. Some examples, in the build-up to Killiecrankie, the Council ordered several shires on the Army's route of march to provide draft horses for the baggage train. In another more mundane instance, they ordered cartouche or cartridge boxes to be made for several regiments by an Edinburgh cabinet maker and corresponding bayonets by a cutler. And later on, in the summer of 1690, they were coordinating larger contracts with several groups to fashion deals, these are large wooden stakes, and transport them via ship from Leith in Glasgow to make the walls of Fort William and Inverlochy. So in practice, however, the Council faced major challenges in maintaining effective communication between the centre and what was happening on the ground. So beyond these more mundane instances, their direct interventions into the war were much less successful. So they had to deal with a variety of issues facing the new army, which was under-equipped to the point that they didn't actually have uniforms until 1690 for some regiments, as well as direct the resources and manpower to deal with the Jacobite threat across a vast area of Scotland. And in the early stages of the conflict, the Jacobite army remained highly mobile. From May until July 1689, the main body of the Jacobite army was locked in a battle of cat and mouse with the main Williamite field army, led by Mackay in person. As Mackay was often in the field, it was left to the Privy Council, with the advice of senior officers often appointed by Mackay, to oversee the war effort in other parts of the country. And this included the shoring up of critical garrisons and the establishing of new ones in disaffected areas, such as Angus. The communication with the officer corps was a critical aspect to the Council's role, as the officers would go to the Privy Council seeking new commissions, equipment, money, or to bring pressing matters to the central government's attention. Usually, police can have some more money. A pressing matter in April-May 1689 was the fact that most of Ireland was in Jacobite hands, with only Derry holding out against a siege and other small pockets of resistance. And this in turn caused the Jacobite clans of the Kintyre Peninsula to take up arms and seize control of Skipness Castle. Now this caused a great deal of concern as it raised the spectre of Irish troops making the short crossing to Kintyre and causing all sorts of havoc. Despite Mackay and the bulk of the army's engagement north of the Tay, the council was able to organise a fairly rapid deployment made up of a detachment of 500 men from 2 regiments within 2 weeks. And this was actually a success, with a victory over the Kintyre Jacobites achieved at the small Battle of Loop Hill on the 16th of May 1689, thus denying the Jacobites control of the peninsula and the castle. However, the council did not always rise to the occasion, and in the aftermath of the infamous defeat of the Williamite army at the Battle of Killiecrankie on the 27th of July 1689, the shortcomings in communication had become abundantly clear. The Williamite army took 2,000 casualties at the battle, and for context they had around 3,500 men in total. Some higher estimates have it at 5,000. With many of the surviving soldiers fleeing down the pass of Killiecrankie, carrying doom-laden reports with them back to Edinburgh. And this is understandable. Many of these soldiers came from the regiments on the left wing, which had been broken by a devastating Highland charge, partially due to the terrain, and then had been chased, robbed, stripped and assaulted, and that was getting off lightly, by Atholl clansmen sympathetic to the Jacobite army. And one such report from the battle of one of these runaways, as they were called at the time, was that of Lieutenant Colonel Lauder of the 3rd Scots Dutch Brigade. Sir William Lockhart, a Privy Councillor, best summarised this when he wrote, "We doot not, but Major General Mackay, Ramsay and Balfour, with all officers of their regiments," that's the brigade, "that were there are killed. Lieutenant Colonel Lauder, one excepted. Lord Kenmure and Lord Belhaven are certainly killed." And Hamilton summarised the black mood of the council in the days after the battle when he wrote to London, quote, "Now Dundee will be master of all the other side of the Forth, where there are so great numbers of disaffected to join him. So the king must make haste, for I fear we shall not be able to defend this side of the Forth for long." Within days after that, it became clear that the first reports were exaggerated. Not only was Mackay alive, but so too were many of the named senior officers that had been feared dead, as well as a detachment of 700 survivors whom they'd managed to keep together. Moreover, it soon emerged that Viscount Dundee had been killed during the battle, which was an obvious propaganda victory. This confusion, propagated by these reports, which were then passed on to London by the council, had a wider impact on the war effort overall. Scotland was just one front as part of a general European war. With orders for reinforcements from England, originally intended for Ireland under the Marshal Schomberg, having to be countermanded in the following weeks. And this confusion is a useful example of the drawbacks of the Privy Council's direct interventions during the war. Upon his return from Killiecrankie, Mackay recalled that the council had adopted a defensive strategy, which, quote, "tended to abandon the northern counties of Scotland to the enemies," end quote. The council had gathered all of their forces around Stirling and had fully intended, had Mackay's death been true, to sit there and wait for reinforcements to come from England. And according to Mackay, such a strategy was untenable, as if the Jacobites were left to their own devices, he feared the north of Tay. He feared that they would not only have, quote, the best men of that kingdom for the war, but possession of tunes and public revenues whereby they could form a fashion of government. And the threat of a legitimised Jacobite shadow administration with access to the revenues of towns like Aberdeen and Inverness, where the forces would be isolated if the main body of the army sat here in Stirling, cannot be understated. And it was for this reason Mackay ordered the council strategy to be countermanded almost immediately upon his return, adopting a more offensive posture by resuming what he knew best, pursuing the Jacobite army in and around the Highlands for the better part of a month. However, the Battle of Dunkeld serves as another good example of this confusion and conflict between the council and the military side of things, the commander-in-chief and the officer corps. In military matters, Mackay's experience was often relied upon. He'd been appointed by William of Orange, which was then recognised by the Committee of Estates, and the council were largely content to allow him to direct the strategy, and usually they would defer to his knowledge. But Killiecrankie had shaken their confidence in the Major General, And in their desperation to secure Atholl and the road to Perth, which had already been raided twice in 1689, they deployed a large detachment of the Earl of Angus's regiment of foot, also known as the Cameronians. Now, the Cameronians were obviously followers of the late Presbyterian preacher Richard Cameron. They were not exactly known for their religious tolerance. And in correspondence with the council, Mackay voiced concerns about the regiment being garrisoned in Dunkeld, as they were, quote, generally hated and feared in the northern counties. When the Jacobite army came into Atholl in mid-August, several inhabitants of Dunkeld reportedly sent word that the regiment was isolated there, and this led to the famous or infamous Jacobite assault on the town and a miraculous but costly victory for the Williamites. And although Dunkeld is held aloft as a stunning defeat for the Jacobites, in actuality the Jacobite army was merely wounded and humiliated. The Jacobite threat continued to be viable until at least August 1690 and arguably into 1691. The Williamite Officer Corps in Scotland viewed Dunkeld as a military disaster averted rather than a victory achieved. And in the days before the battle, Lieutenant Colonel William Cleland of the Cameronian Regiment, who sadly passed away there, had requested an order to withdraw to Perth. As the initial order, however, had been issued by the council, the local commanding officer at Perth, Cleland's superior, Colonel George Ramsay, argued that the council should issue the withdrawal order themselves and wrote to Edinburgh to tell them such. Mackay argued later on that Ramsay, a fellow Scotch Brigade officer, should have acted regardless, but that the overall blame lay squarely with the council for, quote, giving special orders for the posting of forces which they ought to have left to the judgment of officers. And such confusion and disagreement perfectly summarises the council's overall coordination of the Highland War. Although the Committee of Estates had allowed them to rapidly assemble a sizable standing army for Scotland and muster the fiscal military resources of Scotland against the Jacobites, their direct interventions into the conflict often left much to be desired. In the winter of 1689-90, the council was faced with an increasingly belligerent and empowered parliamentary opposition, and this in turn caused the Parliament to withhold vital acts of supply to fund the Williamite army and keep the Jacobite threat in check. And this is part of the reason this civil war dragged on for longer than some have realised. Additionally, faced by a dearth of funds, the council became less and less proactive in their support for Mackay's strategy, which culminated with him going directly to King William in May 1690 to gain his support for the large-scale offensive which established Fort William. And he was successful. William ordered the council to offer Mackay financial and logistical support, which they did, albeit reluctantly. Although the campaign was successful in some respects, the problems of communication were laid bare again, with Mackay and the bulk of the forces so far away from Edinburgh. And this came due to the French Navy's victory over an Anglo-Dutch fleet at Beachy Head on the 10th of July 1690, which made the Privy Council intensely paranoid of a Franco-Irish invasion, particularly in view of William's absence on campaign in Ireland. Moreover, rumours about the defeat at the Battle of the Boyne, propagated by notable Jacobites, only increased this anxiety until they heard further word. The council dispatched an express to Mackay at Inverlochy, asking him to come back as soon as possible, but this did not arrive for almost a week, at which point the Williamite army then began marching southwards with some haste. In spite of the Privy Council's misgivings, the effectiveness of Fort William in supplanting other garrisons around the Highlands became clear over time, with Colonel Richard Cunningham, a Williamite Dragoon commander and former Scots-Dutch officer, putting it best in the winter of 1690. Quote, "My party is stronger than any they can bring to the fields, and this is the only time in the year to ruin their country, just when they have taken in their corns, which is the most part of their subsistence for the winter time. I shall be somewhat troublesome to them blades in the hills if they have anything to lose." Now, I'll briefly conclude. Unlike its larger neighbour in the south, the Scottish Williamite state did not radically overhaul the manner in which it conducted war post-1688. At the heart of this was the Privy Council adopting the precedential role of coordinating central executive, which the Committee of Estates had previously filled, and their role as a nexus which communicated between the army and the centre, which admittedly had mixed results. It is undeniable, however, that the Williamite government in Scotland was able to rise to the military challenge, it faced in early 1689, and to ensure their control of the bulk of the country by late 1690. Ultimately, their de jure control of the government of Scotland and subsequent access to revenue and manpower allowed them to outlast the Jacobites in the field and bring their enemies to the negotiating table in late 1691. The Privy Council played a critical role in achieving that modest victory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another really interesting paper, and I think between you, these two papers, it seems to me, are linked by a couple of themes, which we may explore in the questions here. Firstly, there's the sense of the Privy Council playing a role in protecting the revolution or entrenching the revolution in various ways. But linked to that, there's also a sense from both papers of a slightly blundering Privy Council or an idle Privy Council, which is an intriguing idea, which I'm sure we'll want to explore. So thank you once again to both speakers, really fascinating stuff. And I'll open up the floor either physically or out in video conferencing land to questions.
Yes, John.
Yeah, question for you. What do you think, from the perspective of the Privy Council and what you've been talking about in the Highland War, what do you think the Irish side fits in? Because it's all interlinked, isn't it? It's our days of talking about strategic security here, Stirling, whatever. But a lot of it, like the West Coast or the Port, the Greenock or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it fits in massively. Having read your own article on the Siege of Derry, of course, it's one of these conflicts that I think I was trying to hit on with the paper that I couldn't really fit in. Mackay and the council, Mackay is a councillor himself, so he's kind of embodying the military aspect of the council. They constantly argue about the deployment of forces and where they should be, and I know Claire spoke about the Irish invasion scare in 1693. I think it's a prolonged invasion scare from 1689. They seem to be constantly afraid that this will happen, and Ireland is massively important. There's 300 Irishmen who managed to land in Scotland in May 1689, and they're actually present at the Battle of Killiecrankie. So there is an Irish presence in the Jacobite army, and of course the two commanders after Dundee both came from Ireland. Alexander Cannon, they were both Scots, but they both came from Ireland, having been at the court with James. So I think what I tried to do with my thesis was sort of take in that broader aspect and talk about it in more of a Scotland's part in the European conflict, while also focusing on the conflict in Scotland. Thanks very much.
Questions?
There's a few coming in on
Right.
here. If you
Well, Julie's popped his hand up, so we'll maybe ask Julie and then we can use the
thank you to both the speakers. Possibly could ask questions to both, but maybe a question to Claire. Is there anything about persecution? Because so William famously said when he took the royal oath that he didn't want to be a persecutor. Does that word get used? Is there a broader discourse around what might or might not be persecution?
Thank you, Julian. It's a really fascinating question. Just to clarify, when you said, is there any discussion of persecution, do you mean by the council or do you mean by Catholics or by ministers?
Well, I leave that up to you, but I suppose one thread, one thread, sort of perhaps in the question is, might the council or anyone else have gone, oh, perhaps we shouldn't do that because that might be persecution?
Yeah, okay, so in terms of who talks about this in terms of persecution, it is obviously, as you'd expect, Catholics themselves. And I imagine that if I was a Catholic living in 1690 Scotland, I'd probably characterise what I was going through as persecution. At the same time, though, you have to treat Catholic sources with a pinch of salt, because a lot of their letters are directed towards the continent where they're trying to get money for the mission. So it's in their interest to really play up what what they're experiencing.
So in fact, it's the Protestants, you know, if they use that word, it'll be more interesting when they do.
Yes, exactly. And in my paper, I was, unless there was a slip of the tongue, I was quite careful to use the term prosecution rather than persecution by the council. That said, in terms of the council possibly holding back on things, I think that there is definitely an element within that might be contributing to the fact that they're not really seeking to clamp down on Catholics unless they can see that Catholics are posing, you know, a direct civil or immediate political threat. Frankly, they're not that bothered if Catholics and Protestants get married. No one really cares. Ministers, however, do care, but that in itself is interesting because when ministers themselves in sermons talk about Catholic persecution, they say, well, we're different. We don't persecute people for their beliefs.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that ministers will say that, but then they're agitating for the council to take more of a harsh stance. And the council are the ones saying, well, hang on, I mean, we could do that, but it's going to be a bit counterproductive. And is this something we really should be doing as, you know, more enlightened? Doesn't this make us just like the papists that we, you know, purport to despise? So it's a really interesting line of inquiry.
We've got a few questions here. Firstly, from Lorna Kinnaird, are there any handouts or key points / acts / dates, etc.?
I think that's maybe something we could provide after
Yeah,
all of us. If we could provide some support materials, maybe something we should have done in advance.
And Callum Cunningham's got a question for Claire, please. How influential do you feel the Privy Council's policies and legacy regarding popery were to later Scottish politicians and jurists?
That's such an interesting question. I don't know if influential is necessarily the right word, but what happens after when the Privy Council gets abolished in 1708 is that you get these circuit courts set up the following year. And it's the circuit courts that thereafter become the ones who are dealing with Catholics sort of at the coalface of the problem. I would be very interested to look at the records of the circuit courts where they exist. I didn't get to look at them during my thesis, but I would be really interested to see how far they're attempting to follow the precedent set by the Privy Council, because that's really the only example that they have to follow. So that would be a really interesting thing to look at. I imagine that at least in the initial years, they probably do look at what the Privy Council had done quite closely because they've got nothing else to go on. And then I'm just thinking in terms of as the British state gets more and more involved in this, so in the 1720s, when you have Argyll and Islay sort of really stepping up the management of the Church of Scotland, and popery does come into that more. There, they don't really talk about the Privy Council as much. It's more just like, okay, well, we have this problem, how do we deal with it? But that idea of precedent is a really interesting one, so thank you.
More questions? Disconnect between the Privy Council and army officers, the Privy Council and ministers on the ground. I just wonder if you get any sense of whether it's a monolithic disconnect, that is to say that the council as a whole, or whether there are one or two people suggesting we need to listen to people on the ground a bit more. Is there, I mean, maybe this is something that we discover, we may never discover this, it's something we discover at the end of the project, but you know, it's if you like, it's the kind of parliamentary equivalent of not an opposition party, but opposition views. This isn't good enough, councillors. You know, is there any sense of that? I mean, it might be easier with the military side of things. You know, saying that you know the council need to listen to what the army officers say,
Yeah.
and not act on their own.
They're in constant communication, particularly despite the extended lines of communication, the Secretary of State Melville really sort of stands out as one of these voices that on-off supports Mackay. He was one of the exiles with William of Orange, of course, and having come over with the army, his son is in the army as well as a colonel of the Regiment Foot. So he's pretty, yeah, I would say
He's in both camps.
Yeah, he's in both camps. At points, I've read a lot of Mackay's memoirs, Stockholm Syndrome or Amsterdam Syndrome, if you prefer. But so this is a retrospective memoir, and he writes quite scathingly about almost every politician, to the point where he just basically, the country of his birth, he's like, he doesn't really, I can't remember the direct quote off my head, but it's a real distaste for the country and the service, and that's how difficult his time in Scotland was. And I think a lot of that was to do with political restraints that the council found on themselves. They were trying to manage the politics in the Parliament for William, and then they're also trying to manage the finances, which frustrates William massively because I don't think he sees Scotland as a sideshow, but he doesn't really see anywhere outside of Europe as worth sort of considering. He only gets involved in Ireland because he has to, and that's kind of like, well, I'm going to go and sort this out, and he doesn't do it. But yeah, no, I think you're right. There must be these debates. It's funny when we were talking about this earlier with the bar and the delineation, with Robbie's example of the everyday table. It's almost like there's this kind of a bit of a side point, but there's almost like two sides to the table, two hats, if you want to say it, like secret business. Because after Killiecrankie, all those false reports spread all over the place, and they almost completely mess up a huge army deployment to Ireland, which was desperately needed at the time. So William's furious, and so is Melville, because he's the one who carried all this news from Hamilton, Lockhart, and people like this, you know, and they're like, oh, we're going to lose the war. And he's so furious at the end of it. He's like, well, you should look to yourselves to sort this out, kind of thing.
There could be a prosopographical way of looking at this, which is that, you know, because some of these Privy Council members will have relatives who are army officers.
Yeah,
Similarly, with your topic,
Yeah.
there will be those that may not be Catholic, but could have Catholic friends. You know, it's seriously, you know, people that they were, you know, might have had military experience with, or some other types of experience with, or a bit of intermarrying.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean this points to the importance of getting into the fine detail of who these people are.
Definitely. I mean, I think it's building on what Graham said. It doesn't even necessarily have to be opposition. It's more just personal relationships. You know, the councillors, they don't exist in a bubble. They all have families, they all have friends, they all have their own personal interests and connections. So if we're able to kind of get under the skin of what some of those connections are, then I think that would be really useful.
So how does that, do you think, relate to Maxwell? The case you made about you know, him being the local president, not managing to keep him in line.
Well, it's a really interesting one because after that particular disturbance happens at Christmas, Maxwell of Nithsdale decides that he is going to sue the three ministers who led the mob to his house. And we have documents about this, and it gets as far as the Justiciary Court in Edinburgh, and then the case is suddenly dropped. And the evidence is that the reason it's dropped is because Stuart of Gutters writes to Nithsdale and says, just leave it, because it's not going to end well. I haven't seen the exact letter, so I don't know what Gutters' exact words were, but I've seen a summary of it in Nithsdale's own correspondence. So if nothing else, that shows us that these connections and these relationships did have an impact on how those types of cases developed.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Fascinating.
And Julian had a...
Yeah, so just to come in on this and you know, the various places where you can get disagreement, opposition, and so on. There's a sort of thread of money going through your paper, Graham.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Laura Rayner, and she's one of the few people to have looked at the Treasury Commission.
Yeah.
And there's at least a possibility for disagreement, not only between serving officers in the field and privy councillors, but the politicians who want to do things and the people who have to sign the checks, or whatever the metaphor is. I think Laura didn't find sort of disagreement, as it were, between the Treasury Commission and Privy Council, but you know exactly how the relationship works. I mean, you know, the Treasury Commissioners will be Privy Councillors, but how the demarcation between those bodies, you know, gives a there's possibilities for complexity, and given that money is so important, I wonder if you could say a bit more about the role of money in this campaign and the Treasury Commission, if you know about it.
Yeah, well, for my last chapter, I stupidly tried to tackle the fiscal military state in Scotland, and added that to a Scots Dutch Brigade dissertation, so it was kind of like, why did I do this? So I've actually been fixing that chapter, but yeah, I think what you do see is it's often sort of added to William's later ill years, like the state struggling with money, and it did struggle with money through the Highland War, But in 1689, there's a massive increase in the army, and well, proportionately massive to what came before. And you do see this increase in spending and then this just complete fall. They can't afford to keep it going. And I think as well, obviously the commander-in-chief of the Scottish forces is an officer of state. And then you have these other officers who are in the army who are paid through the treasury books. So there's this kind of, I really looked to build upon Laura Rayner's article, because one of the things I thought was missing was the military aspect. The Treasury Commission relations were really well fleshed out. And the Commission, I've got to say, I don't really know of any conflict between the Commission and army officers themselves. They'd usually go through the council itself if they were begging or looking for anything.
A supplementary question on that would be borrowing of money, because
Yeah.
you know you don't empty the piggy bank in order to pay for your war. You borrow, and then and you know the sort of fiscal military state that you're talking about is about long-term funding debt to pay for your wars, which, as you say, the Scots don't do.
Yeah.
But they, there must be some, somebody must be getting credit from somewhere.
Yes, I think it's mainly based upon, and obviously this is quite a supplemental paper. This sort of came out of. This kind of came out of the stuff I did, and I didn't really look at the Privy Council completely, like on its own. It was always in relation to the brigade and the war effort and things like that. But I think one of the things I found towards the end of the thesis and in this financial chapter that I didn't get to put in was private credit networks and how much officers are drawing upon not just collectors of revenues, but private, like, merchants for money. And then you get all these merchants breaking down the door in 1692 and 93, going, where's my money? Lord Rollo owes me money. He's not even got a regiment anymore and he won't give me any money. So can I have some money?
Yes, so the broader context of this is that, all this credit is going to have a role in 1695 with the Bank of Scotland, Company of Scotland, and so on. So yeah, there's a big picture here, isn't there?
Yeah, and the brigade as well, coming in like with the auxiliary forces. What's interesting about the brigade is that they bring £10,000 sterling with them, and it's previously been thought, which is, it's not small change, it's previously been thought that it was used to pay them, but they were already paid, and they were being paid from London. They brought the money to kind of put into the Convention of the States army and to levy regiments at the outset. So there's a part of this coming from London as well, and from William and guys like the Earl of Portland, who are one of these people who is not on the Privy Council of Scotland, but he's one of these people that kind of speaks up for Mackay and the Commander-in-Chief from London when he hears of these, particularly Melville blocking things because, well, we can't afford that right now. And the Fort William project is a prime example of that.
So this is actually an English subsidy to the Scottish military
in part,
infrastructure.
I
mean, Laura Stewart's written about that for the 1640s. I hadn't realised that was happening in 1680s.
Yeah, it's only kind of small stuff I found. It's in the treasury books, the calendar of the British treasury books, I think it's called. I might be getting that wrong. But I've also found stuff like when William's Dutch guys were being pensioned off, the brigade is being paid partially. It's paid through the English Treasury, but it's later then repaid by the States General. So it's still technically a Dutch regiment in Dutch service. So that's just me being passionate about that.
Just I end up with a coherent question, so forgive me. You've got a contrast, haven't you, between an active government and an inactive government, and why governments choose to act or not to act. And one's dealing with a clear and present danger, so you have to kind of deal with it.
Yeah.
And the other one, they clearly don't regard it as a danger. They regard it as pretty secondary. And it would be tempting to think, well, you see, the age of reason's just round the corner. Mm-hmm. And we're gearing ourselves up for that, enlightening. But then I was thinking back 100 years. And if you think of the Catholic rebellions of the 1590s, the King, the Privy Council, his lords, they got very active about it. They went out and did something. The rest of the time, the government's getting bombarded by petitions and letters from General Assembly, synods, presbyteries, individual ministers, saying you have to do something with these Catholics.
Yeah. And
they just don't bother. They don't bother at all. Now, the aberration in the 17th century surely has become an anti-period, because that is the period when the Privy Council does get involved in persecution. But it's not Catholics. It's as though the norm is all that blood, but a few people in Barrowby, quite frankly, and some house group in the Canongate.
Yeah.
But the Covenanters was something different, but it was political, it's not religious. So the default of the elites and the institution, perhaps, is this is just not our business.
I think that you're probably absolutely right, and of course it's something that the government, using a very broad term there, gets a lot of flack for from the Presbyterians once they're re-established in 1690, saying, you know, we've just gone through 30 years of being persecuted, and it was you guys persecuting us, and there were all these Catholics, and you didn't do anything. And to a certain extent, yeah, they do have a point, because Catholics, because it's not just that they're such a small element of the population, it's that they're really far away as well, and that is it just removes a lot of the incentive to do much about it. And also you've got the heritable jurisdictions to contend with. That makes actually enforcing these laws really difficult. So yeah, and at the same time, I mean, in the period that I look at, by the time you get to 1700, the Privy Council, frankly, has got a lot more other things to be dealing with. You know, particularly you've got this emergent country opposition in Parliament that's trying to bring down the government. You've got all these emerging negotiations about union. There's a lot going on. So it's not that they're always inactive about Catholics. As you say, there are sort of these flashpoint moments when they do act, but yeah, it's just a matter
but
of
it's likely to be
priority.
the case, if you can imagine, as I've often imagined, that James VII was a Protestant. You saved me a lot of grief.
I mean, that's
If you imagine that,
Yeah.
right? It's only Jacobitism that kind of fuels a lot of this anxiety, I think.
On the
Right?
civil
If
side.
if there was no Jacobitism, it didn't exist, then probably there wouldn't be any difference between the actions of the 1690s to the actions of the 1590s.
But there aren't that many differences as there are even with the Jacobite element, like I said, sort of, you know, they go after their weapons, they go after their horses and their arms, but they're not, the civil authorities aren't necessarily so bothered about their religious aspect, as long as they don't really do anything with it. Like I say, you know, as long as,
make a fuss.
as long as Catholics keep themselves to themselves,
Yeah.
by and large they'll be okay. Now that's no guarantee, and if, like I say, if I was a Catholic, you'd still feel worried because there is the potential, you know, that law is there, it's on the statute book. The conflict that I find so interesting is that ministers don't view it in purely civil terms, and I think that that's a mistake that historians have made in the past, that they assume that from the church's view it's all about the Jacobites. It is about the Jacobites, but it's also about a lot more than that.
Yeah.
It's cited at points of geostrategic weakness sometimes during the Highland War. Talk about papacy and popery in these disaffected areas. But disaffected areas also apply to like Angus, Aberdeen, Inverness, where it's Episcopalianism that they're more concerned about. So it's kind of, I think you're completely right. You know, it's this, they're more concerned about their politics and the fact that they have weapons rather than the fact that they're Catholics.
To come back to Keith's question, and the 1590s is fascinating sort of comparative. One of the variables would be foreign policy, isn't it? Because, you know, depending on what James and his councillors' foreign policy agenda is, that could be an anti-Catholic one, or it could be let's cozy up to the Spanish and the Infanta. And you know, William again has got foreign policy agendas, so I'm told.
Well, William had more Catholics fighting for him than James, so you know.
William had chief Catholic allies.
Yeah, and he
Roman
had
Empire.
papal backing, so you know.
Okay, I think we should probably call this session to a close because our break time is closing in. But thank you very much to the speakers for two fascinating papers, and thanks to everybody for the discussion as well. As with all of today, the discussion has been equally as fascinating as the papers. But thank you very much to Claire and Graham for the papers and for this session.